Well, hey everybody, my name is Matt. Tonight I'm doing a presentation on high-order components in a React environment. So since I've got involved in React, high-order components are definitely my most favorite thing about the React environment, just because it's a good way to code smarter and not harder, and who doesn't love doing stuff like that? So my start with high-order components, I got involved with them for a couple reasons. Firstly being the inquisitive mind. I found myself using a lot of like NPM high-order components that I was installing where I didn't quite understand what they were doing behind the scenes, and kind of my desire to learn a little bit more about what they were doing behind the scenes definitely got me involved in this. Less code and more power. When I kind of went through my different projects and put high-order components in there, I was able to eliminate like hundreds of lines of code, and that's definitely something I'm sure we all can find some satisfaction in. Reusable solutions is another big reason I got involved in high-order components. I wanted to solve a problem once and not have to solve it again 10 more times down the road. I wanted a piece of code that I could kind of reuse in all my projects. And sharing solutions. I wanted to get more involved in the open source community on GitHub and NPM and be able to submit packages that aren't just going to solve the problem for me, but it's going to solve the problem for the next developer who needs to solve that problem. So that was something that was really important to me. So a little bit of overview about what we are going to talk about. Obviously a little bit about high-order components. If you are not familiar with what that means, I'll go over that for you. Some useful examples, because we all want examples that we could actually use in real case scenarios, of course. Some modular code, how to make these pieces of code modular and be able to be reused throughout your different projects that you're working on. And then a little bit about open source. So a little bit about high-order components. Essentially, it is just going to be a component or a function that's going to take in a component and return a new component. At its base, that is the definition of a high-order component. If you're familiar with Redux, think about Redux. That's probably the most popular or well-known high-order component. That is going to take in a component and it's going to build a wrapper component that goes around the component you submitted it and give it back to you. So that's what we're talking about high-order components. They're also known as pure functions as well, where the return value is the same for the same argument. So every time you give this high-order component the same argument, it's always going to give you the same thing back. It is also not going to have any side effects or mutations on your original component. That's really important too, because if it's actually mutating the information that you give it to, it's not going to be reusable across different projects. So that's very important. So let's kind of go over and look at the first example that I was looking at. So the problem I had is something simple enough, but it's something like the solution could be used everywhere in my code. I wanted to build a responsive navigation bar without using CSS media queries. CSS media queries can often get way overdone. They can kind of get bogged down and real convoluted real quick. So I wanted a way to solve it that I could kind of use throughout my entire program. And that was basically through the use of props instead of CSS. So what are the requirements that I was kind of looking for? Whenever I'm building a high-order component, look at what does it have to do for me? I have a list of kind of what it needs to do for me first. So first, it's got to pass me down the viewing screen width and height as props, and I can use those props to decide what I want to render on my screen. It's going to create that class component that wraps around my base component and returns my base component back to me. And it can be reused for any component. So these are kind of the three bits of requirements that I wanted to meet when solving this problem. So I'm going to take a look at some code now. So this is my Windows size.js file. This is my actual higher order component. So obviously I'm going to import my dependencies. So here, we're exporting a function that's going to take in one argument. The one argument is going to be the base component. And the class it's going to create is this window size class that extends around that. So essentially, we want to initialize the screen width and screen height with something. What we would do here is we start initializing it with the initial window inner width and inner height. The important thing to remember is if the user decides to resize the window, that is not going to change the state here. That's just what it's going to be initially set as. So with React, we have lifecycle hooks. So here we have our component did mount lifecycle hook. So this is as soon as our React component is mounted, it's going to add event listeners to our window. And so anytime that window is resized, it's going to set our state back to the inner width and inner height. And what this results in is your component that is being fed into the hardware component is going to have props, screen width and screen height, which will be automatically updated when your user is decides to resize the window. So that's important for that. And essentially, it returns the base component with any state, with a state that's initialized, and any props that were initially fed in. And that goes along with the not mutating. You want to make sure it gets everything back that it put in there. So if we look at like the implementation of this, so here I have my navbar component. And in this navbar component, I import my dependencies. So now here, this is kind of like the logic, but down here I have these ternaries. You can kind of disregard the token for this talk, but here I have my props.screen width. Is that greater than or less than 600? I can change that number to whatever I need it to be, but this I can essentially decide what I want to render on the screen based on the value of props.screen width. So in this case, it would either render the code that's under that, or it would render my burger nav components. So that's really cool when we kind of export this. This is assuming it's connected to Redux state, but disregarding that, it's kind of we're exporting our component fed into the hardware component, and that's what we export, and it'll be imported to anything else. So like the reusability of this is what made it important to me. So any component that I kind of feed into this is then going to have the window dimensions passed down as props. So I can use this to change which components will be rendered on the screen based on the window dimensions. So essentially, this wasn't just something that could help me do a nav bar. This could help me prioritize the importance of space in the UI on mobile versus computer. I can render completely different components depending on what the user is viewing the website or the app on. So that reusability is really, really important to me. But next, we kind of have this problem, which this has been able to eliminate so much code from my different projects. But I wanted to make a reusable function for handling API requests and information that was on a component that's being mounted. So this is one of my projects that I'm working on. It's a goal management system. Let's say when the page is rendered, it needs to load a certain amount of goals. Maybe it needs to load the user information. It needs to load all this data before it renders the page. I found myself writing a lot of code that did the same thing several different times. So I wanted to make a hardware component that kind of solved that problem. So if we're looking at like the requirements for this one, I wanted it to be able to be used for any API endpoint with any type of HTTP request. So I didn't want to have to ever, write that logic out again. It can store and pass the response data via state, and it passes down whether or not my request is currently loading, so I know whether to render the screen or not. So if we look, this is kind of the hardware component I came out with, and this is ES 2015 syntax, I believe. It kind of looks like it's getting invoked twice, but it's similar to Connect Redux. It's actually invoking a second function immediately after the first one, and they're all the variables are in scope. So I bring in my necessary dependencies. So what I'm exporting is this hardware component that's going to be invoked twice, similar to Redux. The first set of arguments that's going to get passed in there is something like our path API endpoint, and then the parameters for our HTTP request. The second time it's invoked, it's passing in the base component. So when it takes these in, then it's going to create a class that surrounds that. Our state's initialized with our data loading. It's initialized as false. So if we take a look at when our component did mount, so when it mounts, that's when we're going to fire off our API request. So immediately we're going to set our loading equal to true. Then I can run our fetch with the path and parameters that were input in. And then here it's as simple as, as long as there's not an error, I can assign my data to the state res.data, and then I can assign my loading to false. If you're familiar with Redux, what I like to do with Redux is my server will actually respond with an action type. So if that action type is there, then I can fire off this.props.dispatch to my Redux store, and that kind of adds to the modularization of the code, excuse me. Else, if there's an error in this case, we're going to set the state loading to false. And then we're going to return our base component again. So kind of a little bit like what this looks like in implementation is it's getting that loading down as a prop, so we can kind of determine, hey, is our props.loading, is that true? If it is, let's render this component. If not, let's render this component. And then this is a little bit like what the export is going to look like. That's also assuming it's connected to Redux. But we're going to pass in, we have the inject, and then we pass in, this is the goal endpoint of the API. It's a GET request. It has the headers of the local storage token in there. And you can put any request headers in there. So that's like what makes this reusable is that I can pick my endpoint, pick whichever parameters I need on my request, and I can use that as many times as I need to throughout my program. So the reusability part of this is really cool. Is like any component passed in this inject higher order component is going to have access to a specified to the specified API call. I can use this to load any pertinent data on my page after the component is mounted. So like some use cases I might need to do this. I can, if I need to get a username or an avatar upon bringing up the program, or maybe in this case, a list of goals, a list of commented threads, a list of friends, any of that data that I need to get right when the screen is rendered, I can use this higher order component over and over and over again to set that data up. And can also render a loading component on the screen while the API call is being completed. So that's like a little bit about higher order components. I know that's like a super brief introduction. It's kind of like a rough thing to go over so quickly, but some libraries that are really cool for kind of delving in more. When I was doing those export statements, they can get a little bit convoluted and hard to understand. Compose is like a great library to chain together higher order components. It actually reads those components from right to left and is going to make the syntax of exporting those components a lot more simple and more readable. And Recompose is a great library. And Recompose is a library that's essentially like a React utility belt of commonly used higher order components. It's got a lot of great reusable stuff in there. The only piece of advice that I'll give is it is still important to know how these work. You don't want to be using a bunch of different things when you don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. So it's definitely important to learn more about what they're doing. This is kind of a little bit of a look onto what's going on behind the scenes when you use those. So open source is really important too. If you build higher order components for reusable situations, you can share those with other people. You can share them on GitHub, NPM. I think one of the beauties of coding is being able to, share solutions with each other, and there's always going to be something that you can learn from someone else and someone else's style of coding. So I definitely encourage everyone to get involved on open source if you aren't already. And then a little bit about me, as I'm, aspiring software developer, or I guess software developer, aspiring to be greater. I focus on craftsmanship and integrity. In my past, I've kind of had an extensive background in hospitality management. More recently, got involved in software developing. I've been doing a lot of freelance for a long time, but on my path to become a premier app developer, and I'm currently looking for a development opportunity. So if anybody has any insight for me, I'm more than happy to talk with you. And that's my presentation on higher order components. So does anybody have any questions at all?
You nailed it.
Yeah, awesome. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
The first one, you what would you have done if you did the CSS route? Would you have been for the CSS?
If you did the CSS route, which I think, in my view, would be really, really frowned upon, what it would be is you'd be, okay, so let's say the screen width hits this amount. On that media query, you could set the display equal to none on this class, which is getting rendered in that component. But if you take a look at higher order components, and like it's a little bit of more of like an investment in understanding how they work in the beginning, but it's going to be a lot less trouble than going the CSS route, because then you have to account for every class that gets rendered in that component, and it's a lot easier to decide, hey, should I render this component or not render it?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It was unclear to me whether or not the immutability or not screwing with anything outside of your new thing that you're building, is that built in, or is that just your good discipline?
The immutability, it is not built in. It's just you don't want to do it. Essentially, like, so this is, it's just kind of the theory behind pure functions and higher order components, is you don't want to change the data that's already there. So if I have this function that has props,
I totally understand. It's just that a higher order function and pure functionality are slightly different, right? That is I think that's the right way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Immutability.
Have you heard of a render prop in React before?
yeah, render
No, render prop.
prop. No, I'm not familiar with.
So the two schools of thought is that with a higher order component, you could, do exactly what you're talking about. But then when you render prop, you could then pass in an actual component, and then that'll be a render inside of that other component. So why did you choose to go to high order component route, or were you just not aware of it?
The higher order component route, why I chose to go this is because it's a design pattern, and it's like a reusable design pattern, and it really got me into the mindset of solving a problem once the right way and being able to use it for different applications. So I went into higher order components because I wanted to learn more about how writing efficient functions can be used for any given different scenario. And from there, I kind of ran with it because I want to get involved in stuff like NPM, and rather than just rendering a prop, I have a solution I can share with other people, and they can use that too.
Okay, cool.
If possible, would you be able to show a before and after the refactoring using like before you utilize a higher order component to
I could, I don't have the code ready to kind of show a before and after of the code, but kind of giving you an idea of what it looks like. So back here, when we have, when I write this entire function, so this separately before and after, whenever I have my component did mount, I'm firing off an API call. But that API call might need to be made on any number of different components throughout my program. So instead of having this function where I'm passing in my path and parameters, each one is going to have fetch this endpoint with its own parameters. Then I need to take the response.json, and it got to be a lot of stuff that I was rewriting in several different scenarios. Whereas with this, I could just kind of pass my base component into that higher order component, and the rest of everything is already written out here.
Where did you dispatch in this code?
In this code, I did my dispatch here. I was wondering if I should. I'm familiar with Redux, and I use Redux most of the time. So I left this in here just in case. It kind of shows. So if you're not using Redux, you can just assign the data to your state and pass it down as state. If you are using Redux, I would have like my Redux action, or where I'm dispatching to, responded by my actual server, and then I would do, my dispatch that action with the data connected to it.
I'm wondering if, well, props does have dispatch there, so I guess I was just wondering if maybe thunk could come into the picture here,
No, it hadn't.
or if it could.
Thunk?
Thunk,
Redux thing.
Redux
I'm not
thunk.
familiar with
No.
Redux.
Yeah.
Is all the Ajax in Redux? Because I didn't see any.
No, Redux is state management, and that's why I wasn't sure if I was gonna put this in here, because it's a completely different topic than higher order components, but Redux is essentially state management, so
Yeah,
it's
I know that much, but did you do all the Ajax from there instead of inside your components and whatnot?
no, there's no need to do any Ajax inside the Redux. This is essentially, if you were talking about Ajax or fetch request, this dispatch statement is that request. It is sending that information off to where the data is stored. It's just not server side, it's already in the application.
It's different, it's just a better way of doing this dot set state. It's a bit more robust when your application gets really complicated.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's this dot set
I
state.
So-
know how to work that. It's just trying to ask.
Are you looking for where you did the actual Ajax call?
Redux
Yeah,
thunk.
where's
Is
the-
that-
Yeah, where's the source of truth? Where's the data coming from?
The fetch request, okay, so that's coming from the fetch statement here.
Okay.
Yeah, so like this, it's shortened up because I've imported my URL. So it's just URL, it concatenates the path.
I just
And-
missed that slide.
Yeah. Yeah, but this is where all the data is coming from here.
Okay.
It's on GitHub.
Another question?
Yeah.
When you were learning about this and switching over your code, what was the trickiest thing that you ran into? Did you run into any kind of pitfalls or?
I definitely ran into some tricky stuff. Say when you start building these components, it's, it took a while for it to get to the point where it was gonna cover all use cases. When I initially started building it, I would have, okay, well, maybe I just, put the path, but then maybe I didn't have the parameters. So how is it gonna work for a push request versus a get request? And you figure out the different things you need to make that component actually modular. But the cool thing about doing this is it helped me write other functions that are reusable in my code that aren't technically higher order components. Something like I have a fetch request function where, anytime anyone clicks anything and it needs to be dispatched to my server, all it does is it has the endpoint and whatever data it's sending, and then that's just one function, and that's reusable throughout all my code. So that's one of the benefits of getting into the design pattern aspect of this, is when you find a way to write this code in a reusable manner, you find ways that you can do it throughout your code, and then all of a sudden you're shedding off tons of code that you didn't even need to write in the first place.
Did you do any testing to ensure that this stays reusable and it doesn't have any downstream effects negatively?
I did testing in my own app, so it's reusable throughout my own app. I tried to think of ways that this could kind of become not reusable, and I haven't run into any cases where I found that to be true yet. I'm sure it could happen, and that's just something I gotta address when I get there. But seeing as this is kind of like a simple, fetch request, assign the data, I don't foresee it becoming not usable for any scenarios.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you guys.